So please join me in welcoming Professor Close.
Thank you, Julie. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to see most of my family here. And welcome to all the Royal Society members. Is that volume okay? It sounds a bit loud from here, sorry. Okay. So just to start off with, I turned around in my office and took a very bad photo of this award, which I've been proudly displaying in my office ever since it was awarded, the postdoctoral award from the Royal Society in 2002. So very appreciative of the Society for their support going right back to those early days in the academic career. We really were looking for things to put on the CV, and I'm sure it helped me out in getting my career off the ground, so very much appreciated. What is ecophysiology? It's actually the physiology of plants and how it responds to the environment, in particular climate, but also the managed environment. So when it comes to applied science, ecophysiology can underpin work applied to horticulture, agronomy, many areas of agriculture, many areas of application. And I've worked in the nursery industry, in forestry, in revegetation, rare plant conservation biology, and production horticulture for about the last 15 years. So it has been a very interesting career thus far. Okay. So a little bit of background about where I come from. I've been with the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture for the last 15 or so years. We're a research-intensive institute at the university. We're supported by a joint venture agreement with the state government, and the funding through that joint venture amounts to around 10 million. We leverage that to 25 million for an average annual budget. So we do pretty well with competitive grants. And actually the first nationally joint venture arrangement set up along these lines under the directorship of Professor Rob Clark, and other states have followed since. It's a very successful model that's worked very well for us. Initially just research, and in the last 10 years or so, industry development, extension, adoption of new findings, so forth as well, part of our mandate. So I've got also a little bit of data here just sort of demonstrating how important to Tasmania the value of the sector is. So this amounts to about 2.5 billion. When we value add to that, it gets up to around 6 billion. So it's 16% of the state's gross domestic product, and that rises to above 20% when we include employment. More or less, this can split a third between sort of dairy and livestock production. A third between meat production, a third dairy, and a third horticultural production. To support this, through our joint venture, we have about 100 FTEs, 100 staff. We have bases at Launceston, Burnie and Hobart, and we have 2 research farms, a dairy farm at Elliot and a vegetable farm and industrial crops farm at Portside, and we have a Cambridge farm out at Cambridge, clearly, which we lease out mostly. Frogmore Creek is based on our farm, and the rest of it's leased out to Leadington's grazing operation. But it's a great teaching facility. And that brings me to a little bit about what TR does. So we have 2 commodity centres, the livestock centre and the horticulture centre, to support our state's industry and allied. And for about 10 years I was centre leader for horticulture. And then we have our systems-based centres, so that's sort of pre-farm gate and post-farm gate. Pre-farm gate is very focused on whole of ag issues such as climate change resilience, irrigation, soil health, whole of catchment issues, water quality, so forth. Post-farm gate is more along the lines of food safety and food science and technology in supply chains and the like. We use global partnerships to help us achieve our objectives, and last but definitely not least, possibly most important, not the least because of the income it brings us, but the teaching program is training the future of agriculture in Tasmania, and our graduates go the world over as well. So there's about 5 jobs for every graduate within Australia, and also a lot of international demand for ag science graduates if we could only get students to enrol in agriculture, because we're not the most sexy thing out there when it comes to young people and making decisions about what they want to enrol in. Okay, so from there on to a little bit about cherries. just as background, on the left here we've got the volume and value of the Australian export cherry offering, and you can see it's sustainably and steadily increasing. And this is essentially mirrors Tasmania's productions. We provide about 55% of the fruit that's exported internationally. The majority of fruit goes into Southeast Asia, a little bit elsewhere, but mostly into Southeast Asia and usually more into China. This was around the time when we had some agri-politics at play, and a lot more went in by Hong Kong, but most of it's going to Hong Kong, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, places like this. So what those markets want is large fruit. Size is king, flavour is very important, and green stems indicate freshness, but size is king. After that they expect sweetness, balance to acidity, good aroma as well, but the size is the number one thing as well as the firmness that they look at. So we have a lot of focus on size and firmness in our research programs. Okay, so here on the left we've got an indication of the growing regions, the main growing regions nationally for the cherry industry. And what I've listed out here is a little bit of a framework for what I'll cover off on this afternoon. Research not necessarily in chronological order that we've done, but in a bit of the logic of the start of the crop to the end of the crop and when it reaches the consumer. So work we've done over pollination, crop load management, late season rainfall and splitting, training systems for rain covers because of the major investment in rain covers, issues that come with rain covers such as humidity and calcium uptake and firmness, and then some work with doing post-harvest. And I'll finish off on something a little bit interesting around food fraud. Other issues that are big for cherry production but not so much in Tasmania: insufficient chill, heat waves and lack of irrigation. So up in Shepparton, the Golden Valley, where the vast majority of our apples and pears come from, there's water insecurity. We don't suffer from that, luckily. There's major heat waves that cover the southern states, but generally we are sheltered from, and we certainly don't have a concern around insufficient chill. So that's chill units over winter that induce the trees to break bud nice and evenly, which we need to manage a good crop. Okay, so a little bit on pollination, just a minimum of background, but just to emphasise that we've only got one major variety which is self-compatible. Okay, so not surprisingly, 80% of our crop is Lapins, and that's because growers can reliably get a good, decent yield. So that, by being self-compatible, means that pollen can pollinate across the flower on the same variety, even on the same tree. We still need bees to pollinate, but they are genetically self-fertile. All the other varieties we grow, and this is not all of them, but some of the major ones, need crossing, need pollen from a pollen donor to fruit. So Cordia, whilst it's only 10% of our crop, say, is highly regarded and highly sought after in the marketplace. So all growers will have a go at growing Cordia, but the yield arising from Cordia, to a lesser extent Regina, is minor compared to the ready and reliable yields from Lapins. This is just showing the flowering window. It's from the Northern Hemisphere, so ignore the dates, but obviously you have to have overlapping flowering for these outcrossing varieties. You have to have overlapping flowering, and so in years of poor climate during flowering, what they call the fruit salad blocks always have the best fruit set, because there's more varieties that are donating pollen, and so if one's not available at that particular time that the flower's receptive, another variety may be. Okay, a little bit of background. What we did early on was look at there were some major issues in industry with lack of fruit set. And so we sought to understand that so that potentially we could manage it. So what we did was look at when flowers could receive a bee, and we actually tagged each flower, a whole bunch of trees, with the date of when that flower opened. We then went back to the crop at harvest, so we knew every single fruit when that flower opened. And we actually found that over a 4-day window, 80% of that crop was in flower. So that 4 days is when pollination is effective to get a crop. And if, as Murphy's Law is usually the case, you have rain or wind, especially bees are very inactive and like to stay in the hive. If it's windy or rainy, then we're likely to get a very poor set. So you can see the high 80% plus of this particular sweetheart crop pollinated over a 4-day window. So what can we do about that? Well, we can't control, well, we can to an extent with protected cropping, but it's very difficult to control the elements, of course. But what we can do is use a plant hormone, ABG, that counters ethylene. So as soon as the flowers are stressed, if conditions aren't ideal, they will not be so receptive to pollen. And that is countered, that stress, which induces the hormone ethylene, is countered by ABG. So by applying ABG, we found more than a 50% success rate in the fruit set of this Cordia crop. So quite a useful outcome that industry have since used as standard practice to increase the fruit set of that highly valuable variety. For about 10 years subsequent, we applied for funding and failed year after year, and eventually cracked it about 3 or 4 years ago to look at whether we could come up with a mechanical or artificial pollination system for sweet cherry. The Americans started looking at it about the same time as us, and I failed to mention, this is the paper we published on the ABG, and you'll notice this final author, Matthew D. Whiting, visited me on sabbatical in 2009 and has been a close working colleague ever since. He's been trying to work on mechanical pollination, so have we. It's interesting because we're not allowed to share any secrets. It's all closed IP. We're hoping to commercialise. And in other systems, this is almonds in Israel, and you can't see, I don't have an image, couldn't find a decent image of kiwi fruit. They've worked out how to artificially pollinate. So what they do is they have an orchard and they harvest it for flowers. And then they will mill, oh, the video's going to show. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, sorry, Alita. So that was Dr. Alita Isles being interviewed by one of our extension officers that we had for an industry presentation, and she's been leading this work where we're trying to work out how to artificially pollinate cherries. Now we've got a large way through a number of the steps, and this just shows visually collection of flowers to harvest pollen from, pollen milling. We're initially way too rough, and the poor pollen got beaten up by the machinery we were using to mill the flowers with. Sifted pollen, and then different spray technologies you can use to apply the pollen. They're running a commercial operation in Washington State, where Matt Whiting's from. The results are pretty inconsistent, so we're somewhat sceptical around the technology. We think we may have cracked it, and the next season or two we'll be able to tell whether we are effectively improving pollination. Of course, we can, by excluding bees with bee exclusion bags, we can test whether our process is working or not. So, watch that space. It's done commercially in kiwi fruit, as I mentioned, and also in almonds in South Australia. Okay, so that's a little bit about pollination. Next topic, crop load management. So your average tree will set about 2,000 flowers, give or take. Depends on the structure of the tree. And that average tree can carry about 200 apples in the case of apples, or maybe 10 to 15 kilos in the case of cherries. And that's because of this general model. So here we've got the yield of the crop. So we're increasing the number of fruits on the x-axis. As you increase the number of fruits, the yield goes up until it plateaus out because the plant can't sustain any more yield. And we've got this other curve here, which is indicating fruit size. So fruit size is at its maximum, and then as soon as we get intraplant competition for carbohydrates, for sugars, because the leaves can only provide a finite amount of sugar. So once we go over that number of fruit, the size and or other quality attributes start to decline. This is a major issue if the export markets are after big cherries. Because if our crop's too high, if our crop load is too high, we're going to have small fruit. So this might be an optimum size for apple, because people don't actually want big apples. But people want big cherries, so we actually want to be up here. So how can we do this? There's a whole bunch of different plant growth regulators, particularly auxins, you can use with plum fruit. Don't work at all with cherries. We've looked at pruning as an approach, and this is just some results I'm about to show where we looked very precisely pruning bud numbers within spurs. This is a spur on a cherry upright, and these are the buds within the spur. And we thinned each spur down to 1 bud, 2 buds, or 4 buds per spur. And we effectively got a great range in crop load from 14 to 33 tonnes per hectare. And sure enough, we found with that range in crop load, a decline in fruit size and a decline in sugars, a decline in acid levels, which is a major issue because it balances the sugars and really gives the fruit the zing it needs, and a big decline in firmness. So industry straight away got very focused on pruning regimes that would avoid these trees having too many buds, trees having too much of a crop load, because the resulting fruit quality is very poor. This is fruit cracking, which I haven't got onto, it's the next topic. The major problem is with the low crop loads, very high incidence of cropping if you have rain, high incidence of cracking if you have rain. There's less fruit on the tree to absorb that water, so we get much bigger issue of cracking, but I'm going to talk about that next. This was the publication where we reported these results. But the practical upshot of this was that growers agreed, particularly in Tasmania where export markets were focused, that they were going to aim for 15 tonnes per hectare, use pruning strategies and some other crop load strategies such as bloom thinning to try and target that high quality fruit, particularly size. Okay, so the third issue is cracking. This is what makes growing cherries or producing cherries possibly the riskiest business in the whole agricultural sector. Because there's multiple ways the fruit can crack. Essentially, a ripe cherry fruit is very high in sugars and covered with a very thin cuticle. So there's a very huge osmotic gradient between water outside and the sugars inside. So if we get any kind of prolonged exposure to rainfall or even high humidity, we see cracking. And as soon as you start getting cracking, it's probably not worth sending pickers in, because you're picking cracked fruit that's going to be thrown out in the packing shed when they sort the fruit out, and so you're actually ending up behind. This is a bit of an infographic from Professor Greg Lang, a colleague from Michigan State, and it's sort of demonstrating we've got two main types of cracks: a side crack, a nose crack, and what's called a stem crack or a bowl crack. And here's another image from Tree Fruit magazine: the bowl crack, the side crack, and the nose crack. What can we do about it? So I was going through some old photos and I found a photo of a shop me with a lot less hair on the face from 2011. Possibly the wettest cherry season we've had for the last 2 decades, and fairly disastrous for the viticulture industry and for the cherry industry. And this was a photo I took out at Reed Fruits in the Dugald Valley, where they'd called in helicopters at something like $2,500 an hour, after paying $1,500 an hour to have them on standby. And amazing piloting. They were doing grids across the nets. So this is a bird net. So most commercial orchards are bird netted to protect the crop. And these pilots are about 1 metre above the top of the net and doing an absolutely precise grid flying across the crop, and with a huge downdraft, which doesn't dislodge the fruit, but it dries the whole canopy and all the fruit. It's really quite amazing. We were straight in there afterwards checking out the results. I was doing a tour that day, well, but we were in the field. I was in the field with an honours student. We were going around a whole range of orchards, and certainly the investment in these helicopters resulted in a commercial crop being picked, whereas other orchards, such as this one, which was in a different part of the Dugald Valley, which couldn't afford a helicopter, they lost their whole crop. You can't really see the cherries in my hands there, but they're completely split and go into mush. Incidentally, they use the helicopters for frost protection as well, where you've got an inversion layer of warm air above the cold air that settles out, and they downdraft the warm air down, and that saves the crop as well. So what can we do about late season rainfall and cherry cracking? So a colleague, Penny Measham, who did her PhD in TIA some years ago now, was actually the first person to discover the mechanism of side cracks. This graph is for industry, just showing that we have low irrigation and dry soil that are then exposed to simulated rain. We get a much higher occurrence of the side cracks. So she showed a brand new mechanism that's leading to these side cracks, whereby we have dry soil, or dry earth soil, and a downpour of water. The tree rapidly takes up that water through the xylem, which is the wood, the inner portion of the stem, goes up to the leaves, hits the leaves, and then comes back down through the tree through the phloem. The phloem is carrying the sugars from the leaves, but it's swamped with water. This water goes to the fruit and nowhere else to go, so it splits out the sides. So she demonstrated, it was an international first demonstrating that mechanism. This graph here is showing the effect of commercially available sprays, anti-transference sprays. So these are sprays that you spray on the fruit and they prevent the uptake of water across the fruit skin. And that was, prior to Penny's work, the only known mechanism by which cherries cracked. And you would want to buy a pretext because obviously that was doing nothing. This is the control. These are what she's calling cuticular cracks. So these are the nose cracks and the bowl cracks. So this is control, and they were halved by any of these commercial products, just by reducing the water uptake with the anti-transference spray. But do you think that's acceptable? Losing 20% of your, more than 20%, 25% of your crop? No, it's not acceptable. Correct, Doc. Well done. Gold star, Doc. So hence the investment in rain covers, particularly here in Tasmania, where it's a very high value crop. Very quickly, growers and the industry started looking at rain covers because the only way to, some regions, particularly in the mainland, up around Young, for example, had lost 4 out of 5 crops and were going into business. So it was either get out of business or invest in something else. And so research started looking at rain covers. This is some early work again by Greg Lang at Michigan State, looking at hay grove tunnels, which are used in the berry industry, but way too hot and way too humid. So in here the temperatures are around 12 degrees above air temperature, and the humid air is trapped up in the upper parts of the canopy and leads to very soft fruit. So we needed improvement on that. There's been a whole bunch of different technologies that have come on the market in the last 10 years or so, and this is the one that's been mainly picked up in Tasmania. This is called the Bowen rain cover, and it's a hail net with flaps of plastic sewn in that are normally flat and would run the rain from the apex down to and then through the middle of the zip here. You have a drain down the tree interrow that drains the water away. But with any kind of breeze or wind, it blows open those flaps and allows any hot air or humidity to escape. So this was invented by the Bowens, a South German growing family. And Leo, I visited them actually when I was on sabbatical in Italy. Really entrepreneurial growers that have their own orchard and travel the world, have set up a factory to produce this product and travel the world advising on how best to use this product. So we have hundreds of hectares of rain covers here in Tasmania, and we were the first state to take it up. But I need to go sideways a little bit, because as soon as you're investing, I don't know, 150,000 per hectare in infrastructure to keep the rain out, so you've got posts, you've got concrete, you've got all the infrastructure to hold it up, prevent the wind, and in this case up in near Jericho, snow from destroying it. Space becomes a very expensive commodity. And in the meantime, the industry best practice, which incidentally we trialled down at Grove Research Station when I was with the DPI, was the Kim Green bush. Now, speaking of entrepreneurial growers, Kim Green is a very entrepreneurial grower from the Adelaide Hills, and he came up with this approach to growing cherries, where we have a vigorous rootstock. Here's an organic grower, and you need vigorous rootstocks to compete with the grasses and other things that are growing in the organic system. So this is not organic orchard. You can see the herbicide strip here. But in Kim Green's orchard, it's all continuous swathe of grasses and understory, just like Willie Smith's, our major organic producer. So he's got vigorous rootstock, and then he's spreading that vigour out with multiple uprights. So 18 to 24 uprights. If you had a single dominant upright, it would grow into a forest tree, and you would be harvesting fruit on very high ladders, which is highly inefficient and very unsafe. So this is what we call a pedestrian system, because the backpackers that cost us more than for labour than any other part of the world, $24.50 about, for unskilled labour, can harvest this from the ground, or at the very most one step. And also you get good light penetration, so there's quite a number of advantages. The disadvantage is it takes up a lot of space. So if you're restricted to expensive protected rain cover real estate, you need to have a different training system. So we tried with PhD student Cameron Stone different tree structures. This is the bi-bound steep leader, the super spindle axe, the tall spindle axe, and the UFO. Upright fruiting offshoots. So it's a bit like a grape cordon, and then the buds shoot, and you train the shoots straight up. And that's probably the most differentiated training system that we have. It's taking off in New Zealand, down in Central Otago, and we don't have many commercial orchards using it at the moment, except for a very small block at Reed Fruits. And I wanted to acknowledge Andrew Hall. So he's the main orchard manager at Jericho for Reed Fruits, and he worked with us to set up this basically commercial scale experiment, because we have no Grove Research Station anymore. And these are what the trees look like, the bi-bound, the steep leader. So they don't have choice, they're freestanding. This is two-dimensional, this is the only three-dimensional one, the steep leader. The super spindle axe. There's candied flowers on the tall spindle axe, and here's the UFO. This is a photo I dug out from the collection from 2013 at the International Cherry Conference, and this is Howard Hanson looking very happy, and this is Matt Whiting, and he and Greg Lang are acknowledged as the inventors, if you like, or the proponents of this UFO system. So I've got probably more data than you need to know about here. Suffice to say, UFO allows the most light into the system. As you can imagine, it's a very open growing system. And the more light you get to leaves that are close to fruit, the more sugars you have for fruit. So the more open your tree structure, the better. And that came through in both the crop load that was carried and the yields. So the steep leader and the UFO had the highest yields. It was too high the crop load on UFO actually, and we did see a smaller fruit as a result. But we had very high crop load in the lower parts of the canopy in both UFO and steep leader, because we had light penetrating right down through that canopy. And that way we're keeping fruit all the way from the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree. And we're not chasing fruit up the tree. Okay, we're going for time, 4:30. Okay, so fruit quality under rain covers. This is issue number 5. So even under Bowen, it does get humid, it does get warm, and there's a perception that the fruit is not as firm as it should be. So this was a preliminary study with a master's student, and we did find less firmness. So this is a firm tech. It measures firmness by compression. There's a plate here that drops 2 millimetres, compresses the fruit, and it's a very good indicator of fruit firmness, objective measure of fruit firmness. This is just fruit of different ripeness levels or colour levels, and this is the least mature fruit, this is the most mature fruit, and you can see the most mature fruit, we are seeing a difference in firmness of about 20 odd units, grams per millimetre in firmness. So this is to standard bird netting production, this is rain covered, so the fruit in these initial Bowen systems was softer. Whether it was discernible by a consumer was debatable, but it was certainly, there was concerns about whether it would export as well and have the same shelf life as fruit that was grown under netted situations. So to summarise that, there's a lot less airflow under Bowen. We didn't get rain or humidity or cracking, obviously, that's the major benefit, but we're getting some softer fruit. And what's causing that was the question. So along came Cameron Stone, and we decided to measure tree sap flow to estimate tree water uptake, and look at how different that was under Bowen compared to standard knitting. This is Cam, this is Ian Goodwin, who came over from Tatura, who heads up their research station and research team in AgVic and have a fair bit of experience with sap flow. We've got a couple of sensors and a heat pulse is emitted from this middle probe, and the difference in the time it takes to get to the sensor, we can use a model to estimate the amount of water uptake by that tree. So it's pretty neat technology, essentially invented by Dr. Steve Green at Plant and Food Research New Zealand, who we work with a fair bit as well. That's come up okay. Okay, so we've got Bowen trees here, and we've got non-Bowen bird netted trees here. And you can see, that maybe you can't see, this is about maxing out at about 1 litre per hour, and this is maxing out at about 3 litres per hour. So there's a huge amount of water uptake under netted relative to under Bowen. So the first thing when we showed growers this was, well, you're probably over irrigating by about 3 times. You're waterlogging your trees. One, you've got nutrition issues. We can't irrigate the way we normally irrigate because we don't have the water uptake in the tree. So water is pulled like a chain from the soil out through the leaves. It's the cohesion hypothesis tells us that the water maintains its connectedness all through the tree to the atmosphere where we have a high vapor pressure deficit. We don't have that VPD under Bowen or under protected cropping because of the humidity. We don't have that difference in humidity to really pull out. It's like trying to dry your washing in the tropics when the humidity is at 90% compared to when you're in dry air and there's wind blowing your washing. It's really whipping the water out of your washing, and that makes me very satisfied getting washing off the line nice and dry. It's a bit of a strange thing. Okay, so we did some really nice, well, our modeller did some lovely modelling here. So time of day explained about 88 to 95% of the tree water uptake, but that's not 100%, and we aim for 100%. So he looked at the unexplained variability in the water uptake, very tight, this is rain covered and this is netted, very tight relationship with temperature, although it doesn't plateau out, which is interesting, at 40 degrees. We're seeing some photoinhibition, so that's excess light, and this drop off at high solar incidence. But for the first time, this critical threshold of 60% humidity. So this is a brand new finding, really obviously haven't been published, but also for growers, it's okay. How much is too much humidity? Well, now we can say, well, 60% is. Once you go over 60% humidity, your tree water uptake really tanks. So if you can design your rain covers so that you can maximise the amount of time that trees are in this sub 60% humidity zone, then you're going to maximise tree water uptake, maximise nutrient uptake, and maximise fruit firmness. We didn't have any fruit because the bees all went to the weeds. That's another story. In the third study, we controlled the weeds and we did have plenty of fruit. I wanted to highlight here in this diagram that the Bowen netting in response to our second study was completely redesigned. So now the company and the growers were putting bird netting every 100 metres. In some situations where it's flat topography and less airflow, even more often. And that's to get that humidity out, to get that warm air rising up underneath the Bowen and then out through the bird netting strip, which is a wide strip, and allowing that humidity to escape. So they really cottoned on to the negative impacts of this humidity that we found. But as life would have it, we got results almost opposite to what we might have expected. So this is a different site in the Dugald Valley, a much cooler site. We had much better air movement, air circulation, and we set up the study so that we had a gradient of trees furthest from the boundary, as far away from the boundary as we could manage, which was this location 1, and then closer and closer to the boundary. So location 4 was closest to the boundary. To try and see if we could get a gradient in humidity and a gradient in loss of fruit quality. You can see here the difference in wind speeds. This is out in the open. This is similar wind speed no matter how close to the edge we were. Maximum temperatures were increasing, but I've been a bit naughty here, the axis doesn't go to 0, it starts at 20, so there's only about a 4-degree difference in the maximum temperatures. So it is warmer, but it's not too warm, and the humidity was almost exactly the same across the gradient, which surprised us. I haven't even put the data up. So unsurprisingly, the tree sap flow was almost identical. We've got this aberration at site 3 because we think one of the flaps in the bone was getting stuck open, but that's just life. And what happened was the fruit actually got better in quality the furthest from the edge. So the more central the fruit was, the warmer those temperatures, the better the fruit quality. So it clearly was a temperate site. The fruit wasn't getting too hot, it wasn't too humid. So actually we were creating a more favourable condition for photosynthesis. There were more sugars available and they produced sweeter fruit and firmer fruit. So I think the producers of Owen wanted to start paying a salary after I published these results. They were very excited because it showed in some locations you're actually getting far big improvement in fruit quality without the cracking as well. We published that in Frontiers, which was pretty exciting. Okay, so a couple of snapshots of papers presented at the recent International Cherry Symposium in Richland, Washington State. And this is Claire Schofield, who's one of my PhD students currently, based in Central Otago and also does working in Tasmania. And this is the cover slide of her presentation, except this photo which I dropped in there. And what she's doing, this is some of the work in Central Otago. She's got pollination tents and she's varying the humidity. So the hypothesis we came up with after CAM study was that we weren't getting enough calcium into the fruit. So calcium binds with hemicelluloses and pectins in the cell wall to help make that fruit firm. That's the theory anyway. Calcium is only taken up in the xylem. It's phloem immobile. So we can only get calcium in the fruit through the xylem. If we've got high humidity, we're not getting good uptake through the xylem. So we're potentially limiting the calcium uptake into the fruit. So that was the hypothesis around the mechanism for softer fruit when we found that it wasn't just water uptake. So she has been manipulating the humidity in these little tents, and we had essentially the first year of the experiment where we flatlined. We got no interesting results. The trees were settling in. Unfortunately, our low humidities were still pretty high. They're still above our 60% threshold. Trying to get under. But in this most recent season, 2024, we've got exactly what we were hypothesising. So as humidity increases, fruit firmness goes down. There's a lot of variability in the data. It's certainly not clear-cut, but statistically this is highly significant. So as we come up to the 60% threshold, when it's below 60%, we get firmer fruit. So we're very pleased with this finding. Similarly, in that season, the most recent season, as fruit firmness increases, we're seeing increased calcium content in that fruit. So it's, again, statistically significant, a lot of noise in the data, but consistent with the hypothesis. So, of course, we're manipulating calcium within those different humidity environments as well, but we've left that factor out because it wasn't helping us explain it very much. So lots of questions arising from her study. This is another study, this paper I presented at the international conference. Oops, no, I did that. And this is the Cravo system, Andrew Hall up at Jericho, with colleagues Ramandeep, Alita and Nigel. And gibberellic acid is a plant hormone, just as well Jim Reed's not here because he could tell you a lot about gibberellic acid. We use it to slow down the maturation of fruit. It allows us to keep fruit on the tree for longer, to size up more and accumulate more sugar. And it interferes with, that's gone into some automatic jump through. I don't know why. That's a bit annoying. It might jump around a bit, I'm sorry about that. Okay, we want to delay the fruit from being harvested, especially if we're aiming for Chinese New Year, much better prices in the market. But if we had too much GA, we'd have poor return bloom the following year. And these are a couple of studies done in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon State and Washington State, where they applied GA looking under their conditions at how much it delays maturity and increases firmness, and found a really poor return bloom the following season, which means a poor crop the following season. And I had an idea, and that was, this is the stage, these are the stages of fruit growth. So it's a three stages of fruit growth and stone fruit. And traditionally, gibberellic acid is applied in stage 2, mid to late stage 2, to prime before stage 3 cell enlargement. But we applied at stage 1 as well. So there's still a significant amount of cell enlargement expansion happening in stage 1. So we asked the question, if we apply GA at this stage, does it have a cumulative effect on the benefits of applying GA to sizing the fruit and delaying the maturity? This was the experimental design. We've just got an image here showing the fruit stages. So this is shut fall, this is stage 1 on that graph I was just showing you, 17 days after bloom. And this is translucent green, 45 days after bloom. So this is days after bloom until you harvest fruit. So our one treatment was applying GA at low, medium and high rates at shut fall, 15 days after full bloom. The other one was sort of the industry standard, well not the rates but the timing, at translucent green around this time. And the third treatment was applying at both stages. We got a significant effect on the delay to maturity where we applied it both times. So this is our control with no GA application, and at the high rate at stage 2 and all the rates at stage 1 and 2, we've got a 2-week delay in maturity. So it's a major impact on the ripening phenology of that fruit. Very successful if you want to delay harvest, which we generally do aiming for Chinese New Year. This was possibly the most exciting finding. So we've got the firmest fruit in those treatments that receive GA at both timings. So this is the compression test with the Fermentech. So we've got the firmest fruit when we apply GA at both dates. And we've also got the firmest flesh. So this is a penetrometer test where we actually take a bit of skin off and penetrate the flesh to look at how firm the flesh is. And this was associated with significantly higher dry matter percentages and heavier fruit. So for a given size, the fruit was heavier, which made it dense. Now being dense is not always good. In this case, being dense was good. Dense fruit is good fruit. Okay, so on to, this is my second last issue or challenge. So I want to sort of talk a bit about maintaining quality. So once we harvest the fruit, it's running on reserves. It's not going to improve in quality, it cannot. But it's running on reserves. Whatever you pack into that fruit is what it's got to get through its shelf life to the consumer. This is industry agreed quality specifications, and you can see the firmness as a key quality spec, as well as sweetness measured by Brix. So we had a PhD student, Claire McCrory, who worked with us on post-harvest management. So the number one rule for post-harvest management is cool chain. Respiration is proportional to temperature. So the cooler you keep the fruit through that post-harvest chain, the better the quality will be for the consumer. Respiration is directly proportional to temperature. After temperature, the next best thing you can do is manage the atmosphere. So respiration is what's leading to loss of quality. If we have low levels of oxygen, high levels of CO2, we really slow down respiration. And respiration is used for substrate acids in particular, and also sugars. So the faster the rate of respiration, the faster the loss of quality. So Claire looked really hard at different commercial products. This is an ARC training centre with Hanson's and also Woolworths, and looked at some commercial products at the cooling temperature of 4 degrees, which is what they're using in retail, as opposed to 1 degrees they use in export cool chains, and found that the oxygen was actually getting down to 0. I can't go into the detail. It was a whole lecture around fermentation, which is very exciting when you want to make beer, but when you're storing and travelling fruit, it's very bad. Okay, so they're going to anaerobic respiration, where the byproducts are fermented byproducts, which give it a very bad aroma and flavour, as you can imagine. So these commercial products were absolutely terrible for the cool chain if they're storing the fruit behind Woolworths or Coles in their 4-degree rooms. In contrast, Lifespan was doing a great job. We had oxygen levels at about 5%, which is exactly what you're aiming for, and CO2, nice high CO2 levels. So that inhibits respiration rate and also inhibits spoilage, bacteria and fungi as well. But either way, the oxygen was probably way too high. High respiration rates loss of fruit quality. We also looked at flushing. So this is where you introduce a gas mix of a known concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so here, and this is with the same MAP bag. So we've got an air flush control. So this is just standard atmosphere, 21% oxygen, 380 parts per million CO2, and it gets to 10% at about, 8 days. So the fruit is respiring for 8 days until the oxygen gets down to about 10%. So that's 8 days worth lost quality, where it's churning through its own sugars and acids to develop this atmosphere. So it's a passive modified atmosphere. Whereas if we flush it with 10% oxygen and 5% CO2, right from packing, it's got 0 days of lost shelf life here versus wherever this is, 7 days. And it's over another 2 or 3 days, it's really dropping down to 5%. So we're buying a lot of shelf life if we flush the known atmosphere. This was a consultancy, so we've got different MAP products here that I can't show what they are, and this is titratable acidity, so we generally get the longer the shelf life, the lower the level of TA, titratable acidity, because the acids are what are being used as substrates for respiration. And you can see this product here, after 30 days after harvest, very high acidity remaining. So this product was doing a far better job than these other 3 products in terms of fruit quality, because of the different atmospheres developed. Okay, final topic or issue. It's a value chain in food fraud. So we've got we had a project going looking at this, because the Department of Ag and Water advertised for projects looking at supply chains, and we're the only university out of 60 projects to get one. And in the marketplace, the first thing our researcher found was, you almost can't see it, this is Tasmanian fruit, this is non-Tasmanian fruit. So our companies are investing huge amounts of money into researching the best box for presenting your fruit, and then making those boxes, putting the fruit into it, only to get them to the supermarket in China, where they get unpacked and put into 500 gram punnets with a tiny sticker that says this is Tasmanian fruit. So that's because the fruit is so expensive, and I really enjoyed sending this photo to my mates in New Zealand, because here we've got Tasmanian fruit at about 40 euros for a 500 gram repack, whereas we've got New Zealand fruit for less than that, and then the Chilean fruit for well less than that. So this difference in price is driving what we're calling food fraud. This is Tim Reed with the box that I was just referring to. So you can see it's very carefully designed. So it's like a gift box. It's gold signifying affluence. It's major face to present fruit that's very valuable to your friends or family. It's got this technology that is the same as what they put in our cash notes technology that can't be copied so easily. And here we've got a presentation of the boxes and the fruit in the marketplace. But it's not. Look at that box. That box is not that box. That box is a copy. It's a cheap imitation of this box. Look closely at the fruit. Look closely at the kangaroo. Just look closely at almost anything, you see that it's not the same box. So it's a highly lucrative black market where the well-known brands are copied, and we've recently published a review looking at the technologies available to try and get around this. But there's such good payback for the criminals involved in this food fraud that it's very hard to stay ahead of them. This is in the office at Reed Fruits, and this is a close-up of the sticker that's using the same technology as the our cash notes, and QR codes on the boxes that are unique to every box of cherries that take you to the website. So on the imitation boxes, it takes you to a website. The website looks exactly the same, only it ends with .cn, not .au. And likewise, the boxes have this kind of this shaped image on the box, but it doesn't have the same shimmer. But the consumers don't know, or maybe they're too embarrassed to look, or they don't know how to check the QR code, because maybe you have to use a phone, you have to use an app. I'm not great with apps. This is some data that we present with permission from Red Fruits, showing the amount of copying of QR codes. So they're clearly, there's 55,000 pulse reads and 37,000 authentic reads. And this is probably 3% of the cherries that go to China. And therein lies the issue. The consumers just simply aren't using the technology that is available to check that it's authentic Tasmanian fruit. And so we've got a PhD student already started working with the industry in China to look at what the barriers are to using various technologies to check that you're actually purchasing authentic fruit, because it's a social issue, not a technological issue. This is just a fraction of the total number of boxes over there. Okay, so that's an interesting one in food fraud. I'm just a minor player in that research, certainly not a technology person, and I'm working with the Australian Maritime College on that project. So just finally, part of what TR does is industry extension. It's passing on our findings, it's working with industry to design research in the first place, actually, that's the big thing. So co-design is the buzzword at the moment with the funding bodies. We've been doing it ever since I've been working for TR. Basically involves sitting down with industry, sitting down with the NRM group, sitting down with whoever the stakeholder is, saying, okay, what is the problem? How can we understand the problem? Until we really understand the problem, we can't research it. Okay, we're really trying to avoid that university mistake of solving a problem that's not really a problem, of coming up with a solution with no problem. So that's the crux of co-design. And you can't really, we don't get photos of co-design, but these are just a few shots that I pulled out of the collection of just indicating the close interaction we have with the industry. So with Tim Reed and some buyers in his orchard, with Howard Hanson, and this is Professor Stephen Cahoon from the Australian Maritime College, and we're advertising that food fraud project. Industry players, this is Servag, they're now owned by Muir's, get us involved with field days. We walk around orchards with growers and we talk about problems, we talk about solutions. And this was after coming back from sabbatical, talking at the National Industry Conference about some of the findings that were relevant to our Tasmanian and Australian industry. And then it really is the last slide. I'd like to acknowledge the very long list of industry companies and individuals that have supported our research over decades and who I'm sure will continue to support our research. I've got many great colleagues who have been absolutely fantastic to work with, and I'd certainly like to call out Matt Whiting from Washington State. He's been very influential. PhD students have just been fantastic to work with, heaps of fun, do an amazing job. Funding bodies, and I'd like to dedicate this to Emeritus Professor Molyneux. So he inspired me really as an undergrad. His teaching horticultural science really got me excited about horticulture. And also Dr. Nicola Delabato. So he was a colleague who came over on sabbatical. He was a fantastic researcher. He became a fantastic friend. He was an incredibly kind person. He inspired me for his kindness. And he was taken from us too early, sadly. And here he is with Gennaro Fazio, world famous rootstock breeder, at one of his trials up in Trento in Italy. And I was lucky enough to spend some really great quality time with Nicola in Italy, as well as here in Tasmania, working with him and spending time with him. Thank you for your attention.
Well, who would have thought? So many issues. How about some questions from the floor? That would like to pose.
I'll try and bring it around.
Oh, good. We have they'll be picked up better on the on the recording. So, thank you.
Thanks for a very informative lecture. It's nice to see, the scientific approach being applied to such practical issues for an industry. And I did have a question though. That was all targeted at the very high end of the market. And is there a market for less than perfect cherries, and do we make use of it in Tasmania, given that we do have splitting
Yeah.
quite often?
Yeah, good question. There is a market for less than perfect cherries, and that's Coles and Woolworths. And then when they're less than that perfect, they're generally left on the trees because they're so quickly spoiled. So if people often say to them, surely we can harvest them and make them into jam or put them in cider. The problem is it's very hard to predict what the harvest will be for that product, and it's also very hard to harvest it from trees and get it into product before it's spoiled too much because of its high sugar content. So it is a problem. It's sometimes terrible to see the gate shut on orchard blocks that have got laden with fruit that's all cracked. But there's no easy economic solution, or they would have come up with it. They're very clever and savvy, the growers, and apart from putting some in cider as a seasonal thing, I haven't seen any great solution, unfortunately.
Yes, please. Yeah. One there. Yeah, wait for tick. Can you pass it to Kathy? Someone there? Thank you.
Thanks, Dugald. That was fascinating to see. And the other thing, I thought that every kind of fruit was that same kind of effort was probably going into. I will eat my cherries with a great deal of respect. I just wondered if climate change is having any impact on what's going on. Yeah.
Well, absolutely it is, Vicky. So many impacts at so many levels. So, how to prioritise this answer? Probably the most obvious right here, right now issue is in Western Australia, where they don't get enough chilled units in winter anymore for the trees to regularly come out of dormancy into bloom.
Mm.
And so they've had to switch over to new varieties from California, where they're breeding low chilled varieties, which unfortunately produce very inferior quality fruit. So that's a very immediate thing that sort of we've seen most recently. We're seeing changes in flowering. So we did a study looking at flowering dates, and the flowering dates have been getting earlier and earlier and earlier across the whole nation. That has impacts for frost susceptibility and also pollination availability.
Chinese New Year.
That's right, I'm getting fruit into Chinese New Year, yep. And then probably another one is extreme events. Big storms, big rainfall events, floods, droughts. Intensive agriculture is very badly affected by all of those. Fires even. At the international conference I heard a presentation from a colleague in New South Wales talking about apple orchards and their recovery from fire. And I think that was maybe a world first. So, climate change is impacting on fruit production in a big way. Sadly for mainlanders, more on the mainland than down here. So I'm certainly no climate change expert, but because we're surrounded by ocean, we are quite buffered relative to the more continental effects they see on the mainland. We're seeing a little bit more humidity on the east coast, which is an issue for the wine sector. But we're seeing plenty of chill units, and we've got reliable rainfall in the Central Highlands and west and northwest that we can use for irrigation schemes. So current practitioners, particularly in the viticulture industry, are saying a little bit of warming is good for us. We can regularly ripen red varieties and don't have to make emergency sparkling so often. So there's pros and cons.
Okay, thank you.
Another question?
What they're doing in the States is harvesting at night. It's too hot for people, and the fruit quality impacts are bad as well. But they're actually setting up equipment and lighting systems so that this work all happens at night. But there's obviously been a few major safety incidents with that circumstance. I was reading about that just the other day.
Yes, there's one. Rob.
Is geographic location unimportant? It didn't really mention it at all. Lower Midlands versus Dugald Valley, irrelevant or what?
Oh, not irrelevant at all. So location is everything. It gets a lot more focus with wine grapes than it does for cherries, but the whole expansion we've seen in the Dugald Valley is because of the less likelihood of rainfall, late season rainfall compared to the Huon. So, and the rain covers have been focused, investments have been focused down at the Huon compared to the Dugald, because again they get a lot of southerly rain, mist and fog relative to the Dugald Valley. So the Dugald Valley, they've got frost issues. So it depends on where you are and what issues you have, but we've seen a major investment into new growing areas to get away from that rainfall in the case of cherries. So that's what Reed Fruit's completely sold out of Geeston and moved to Dugald Valley for exactly that reason. And Howard Hanson has kept his orchard in Huon, but invested in a big way in the Dugald Valley, and recently just another 200 hectares up around Hamilton. And Lucaston Park, for example, are big in Huon as well, using rain covers increasingly.
The issues that you've discussed with cherries, do they apply to things like grape production in Tasmania as well?
You can get splitting in grapes with very high rainfall, but by far a bigger issue for grapes is botrytis, is more disease due to humidity. And so that's a big focus in viticulture. What else was we about? Fruit set. So they're wind pollinated. So fruit set is not an issue in wine grapes generally. Frost is a big issue for wine grapes, especially at flowering. So we do see variability in yield due to frost. Water availability limits viticulture on the east coast. We don't really see that in the bigger fruit producing regions like the Tamar, Huon and Dugald. What were the other issues? Food fraud, definitely. I've been in China and I've been shown fake Australian bottles on at least 10 occasions. The more expensive the bottle, you're likely to see it. And it looks at a glance like what you might see in Australia, like a Penfolds Grange or whatever. But if you look more closely, it's clearly not. Yeah, so there is similarity, I suppose, in some of those issues. Dissimilarity in others, because wine grapes are processed, obviously, into a product that's bottled. So shelf life and cool chain is not an issue. But quality is, absolutely, and the location you grow them is a very big part of the quality.
Well, we have gone over the time. I just had a quick glance, and we've enjoyed over an hour of very thought-provoking and such interesting issues that you brought before us, Dugald. So we really do thank Dugald most sincerely for, as I said in his card, all the time you have to do to get the thing ready and then to get put aside today to come and talk to us. And we really do appreciate all of our speakers. And Jocelyn, could you get my things and you can present it? Professor McPhee can do that.
Check the label.
No, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dugald.